Every day, your City of Tempe staff goes above and beyond to make sure our community gets the best possible services and the most for our tax dollars. But how good is good? How do you measure it? And how do we know what we really need to make progress on some of our most pressing issues? To guide us, we developed a series of goals designed to help us improve our community based on our Tempe City Council's 5 strategic priorities. Reaching for excellence, we are comparing ourselves against the rest of the nation as well as ourselves. Some of our goals will help save lives. Some of them will help us save money. All of them will help us make Tempe a better place. Tempe Accelerates is an opportunity for you to get involved. Hear what city staff and community partners are doing to reach our goals. Your role? You are a vital part of our community. Share your ideas and help us craft better solutions. Ask questions. Be part of the conversation either in person or online. Check tempe.gov/Tempe Accelerates for dates and times of our next programs and collaborate with us at Tempe City Hall. Today, we will hyper-focus on 2 performance measures. Each presenting team will have 10 minutes to share data, strategies, and progress on a performance measure. Then, you will have about 10 minutes to ask questions or offer suggestions and ideas. On the back of your agenda, we have resource questions to help you participate in the conversation. Also included with your agenda is a quick survey with space you can use to include any ideas or suggestions you might have about today's topics. Thank you for participating. Now, let's accelerate.
Good afternoon, I'm Ken Jones, Deputy City Manager, and we're here for the latest session of Tempe Accelerates, where we're going to explore a couple police functions, a couple police operations. We have a whole bunch of people here in official-looking blue uniforms that are going to take over this presentation, but this is the opportunity we take for our employees to discuss with the rest of our employee base and also the public what we're doing to advance our performance measures. So the first performance measure we're discussing today is police body-worn cameras. And if you all could introduce yourselves and take it away.
Sure. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is James Swig. I'm a lieutenant with the Tempe Police Department. And I'm here with Dr. Brooks Luton, who is the supervisor of Strategic Planning, Analysis, and Research Center for the Tempe Police Department. And as we were introduced, we're here to discuss the body-worn camera activation. So the purpose of the implementation of the body-worn camera is one method that the department supports the city's strategic plan of ensuring a safe and secure communities through a commitment to public safety and justice. The performance measure 1.25 requires that all officers activate their body-worn cameras when arriving to a call on scene by the year 2022 at a 90% rate. The police department engaged in implementing the body-worn cameras in 2015, and from that, we created a work group that consisted of 2 project managers, as well as other employees within the organization from the rank of police officer to sergeant and on up, as well as professional staff. When the cameras were first implemented, we had 50% of all officers assigned cameras. And the purpose of that was to ensure that first the body-worn cameras worked, that we could get feedback from the officers on issues that arose, that we could address any training issues on this new implementation, and obviously to obtain any community feedback. Based on its success, full implementation of all body-worn cameras went into effect in 2016, which included all officers, sergeants, detectives, and lieutenants were issued and trained with the body-worn camera.
So why does this measure matter? There are several goals that we have for our body-worn camera implementation. And the first is that it helps us ensure professional standards. The second is that it collects critical evidence. Now, one thing that it's important to know is that there are limitations to the evidence that you can collect. We'll show you an actual body-worn camera video later, and there's a limited range that the camera can actually see. Oh. All right. We also intend for this to enhance community relationships and to meet citizen expectations. Research shows that body-worn cameras may reduce use of force and reduce complaints. One thing, though, that they don't actually do, or it hasn't been shown yet in research, is that there hasn't been a civilizing effect. Now, by this, we mean there was hopes that body-worn cameras would help citizens and officers both select what they want to say because they know that they're on camera. So the idea was that everybody would be nicer to each other. We would be more civilized. Research hasn't borne that out yet, but again, they have reduced complaints, which is great, and has not reduced arrests. So officers aren't showing a reluctance to interact with the community as a result of these, which is also great. So again, our goal is that at least 90% of officer arrivals to calls for service will have body-worn camera activation by 2022. For 2018, we were at 71%, and that's pretty, how you feel about this can be kind of mixed. I think 71% is pretty great, especially considering that, as we'll discuss, we have a very broad policy, and this is new technology that we're using here. So one question that we get sometimes is, why isn't this 100%? And we do this for a number of reasons. The first is that sometimes we might have things like battery failures or things like that that we would expect. Another reason is that sometimes we dispatch officers to calls for service, like to come serve at council meetings where they won't stand for 2 hours with their cameras on. They're not interacting with the public, and we don't expect them to. So we expect that 90% of the time leaves room for error and for unforeseen events while ensuring a high standard of service.
When the body-worn camera policy was implemented, numerous policies were reviewed, specifically one from the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and that was part of establishing our current policy. Specifically, our policy covers when that officer is to activate the body-worn camera, and we've identified many reasons or many responsibilities they have with that, whether it be emergency calls, or non-emergency calls. But it's important to realize that police officers can be surprised by dynamic events, and activating the body-worn camera will only be expected when it can be done safely. So I'm going to cover 2 types of calls for service that officers are required to implement body-worn camera activation. So an emergency call is a call in progress, such as a robbery, an armed robbery, where the offender may still be on scene or just left. So the officer, when they're en route, they're to activate that camera immediately while they're still en route. A non-emergency call is a call such as a burglary. A community member comes home and they find their house was burglarized, but there's nobody, no suspects are still on scene. The officer is expected to activate the camera prior to arrival and prior to them making contact with the citizen. I'm going to go over a couple things. Specifically, when we talked about body-worn camera activation, it's important to understand that as part of this measure, every officer that arrives is to activate their camera. It's not one officer. So for example, if 6 officers arrived at that armed robbery incident, every officer is to have activated their body-worn camera.
This is important to note for policy because if you're comparing across cities like we like to do to see how well we're doing nationally or compared to other agencies, there's a wide variety in policies across agencies. So some agencies require that there's only one video for an entire call for service regardless of how many officers arrived. Other agencies have limitations on the types of calls for service that they expect officers to activate their cameras for. As you can see, we expect our officers to activate their camera for every call for service at which they arrive.
So I want to talk about the difference between camera being on and activated. Currently, my camera is on. You can see the green light. So if I need to activate it, I simply depress the button a couple of times, and now it kicks into its recording, both audio and video. The camera is always on and recording in a 30-second loop of just video. We're going to show you a video here in just a second so you'll understand that. But the camera's always running. It's in that 30-second loop. And when the officer activates it, it kicks off of that loop and now records everything, both audio and video. But as you'll see in this next video, there's 30 seconds of no sound. You'll just see video. And for the purposes of this video, it has been redacted to a medium blur. Raw camera footage would show everybody's face clearly. It doesn't show the whole scene because obviously it's not getting what's behind them, as you'll see. But for the purposes of this presentation, we provided you with video that is redacted to a medium blur.
So this is a call for service for one of our bicycle officers, and you can tell they're riding their bike actively to the scene here.
And there's no, as you see, there's no audio. You just see the video.
So the officer arrives at the scene and there's people. One of the things to note here is that when officers wear their camera on their chest, like Lieutenant Swick is doing, their hands can get in the way of the camera. And you'll see that if you see the officer put on his gloves for a minute.
Hey, Cliffy, is there anybody else?
So the officers putting on their gloves, which obstructs the camera's view of the scene. And that's about the end. This is just a short and admittedly blurry video on purpose. We do that when we redact videos. But the point is, one, to show you the 30-second delay on audio, and the second to show you that the camera is limited in what it can record. So when the officer bends over to put on his gloves, for example, the camera's view is limited to that forward bending motion. So you won't be able to see if something had been happening to the officer's right or left. You won't be able to see that. So while these cameras are critical for collecting digital evidence, their utility is limited by their ability of the camera. All right, so let's talk data. This is my favorite part. This is actually kind of complicated to put together because we combine a variety of data sets in order to arrive at our compliance number. So we use police calls for service, we use officer unit history, and we use the Axon metadata. So we, in 2018, took approximately 130,000 calls for service. Now, when we combine that with officer unit history data, we ended up with over 184,000 officer arrivals, that's probably in your packet, documented arrivals to calls for service. So, and that happens again because we send multiple officers to calls as necessary. And finally, we use our Axon metadata. At one point, there was a rumor that I found really entertaining that I was actually going around and watching all the videos to see if they turned them on time. And we are absolutely not doing that. Nobody has time for that. Instead, what we do is we have what's essentially a spreadsheet that says who owned the video, when it was created, when it ended, and hopefully tags about the call for service that it's supposed to be connected to and what category it should fall into. So we put all of those data sets together to come up with the appropriate number of arrivals and then matching the videos to the appropriate call for service. So how much data is there? There is a lot. Every month we collect 4.2 terabytes or 16 iPhones worth of video every month. Since inception, we've collected 130 terabytes of video. We've done 466,000 active videos since inception. It's over 800 videos per day. This is a lot of data that we store.
When we developed this policy, obviously it's evolved because we've learned from what past experiences we've had and practices, and we've improved upon it for the purposes of illustrating our commitment to transparency, documentation, and community relations, especially considering the other agencies have a much more limited scope for their policies, excluding many call types. So for example, we've increased our call type. So if an officer engages in a security check, they're required to activate their body-worn cameras.
Right. So one of our strategies to increase compliance on this measure is, of course, training. Now, when the body-worn cameras were first rolled out, everybody in the department that received them, and that was all officers from lieutenants down, had to be trained on them. So this wasn't available in the academy at the time. So officers had to practice, do you want to demonstrate the repetitive motions needed to activate their camera. Now it's funny when he demonstrates it, but keep in mind that officers have a very routine set of motions that they perform when arriving at the scene, and incorporating something new takes time and practice, so everybody had to actively practice doing this. At this point, training to use of body-worn cameras is included in our academy for our new officers, so that's part of our evolving training. We also look at, now that we have some compliance data, where should we start to improve? So we were able to present both to command staff and to individual supervisors. We're able to look at how officers do individually on this. And our goal is to start where there's areas of most need. So I like to use Lieutenant Swig as an example again. So when I look at Lieutenant Swig's example, it's possible that maybe he has a really low compliance rate. But I also know that he's a lieutenant, and I can look at how many calls he went on, and it's not very many, so there's only like 3. So maybe he has a 50% compliance rate, but he only went on 4 calls. And so it looks not so great, but the volume's very small. On the other hand, I'm going to rope in Commander Hale. If Commander Hale was not a commander, but a patrol officer, and had, say, 1,000 calls and a 50% compliance rate, he's the person that I want to target. They'd have the same actual compliance rate, but since his call volume is higher, he's a better candidate for early intervention. So we look at all those things when we take into account who needs additional training on this. When we talk about reporting, again, we've reported this to command staff, to supervisors. One of the things that we learned is that providing visualization of this data for squads allowed them to clarify misconceptions that they might have had, and that just seeing the results for a squad or for an individual was really meaningful and motivating to people. You might not be surprised to learn that sometimes officers are competitive. So that people kind of got into it, but it also, we went around 2 squad briefings, both our tech services unit and my unit went around and made sure that everybody was aware exactly what the policy was and what their expectations were, and were able to clarify any questions that people had. And so as a result, if we look at this over time, we see that our compliance went up over the course of last year.
So what were the challenges when we implemented body-worn camera? Well, officers don't like change, so that was a big challenge. This is new equipment, a new responsibility, new actions. As Brooks mentioned, they had to tap that, so it's getting used to that. And then the new record keeping, as far as when video is obtained, it just doesn't magically appear in the cloud. There's activities. The officer has to put in what the general order report number is, so that way it knows where it needs to go and what type of call it was. That also comes down to if it's evidence or not, because if it's not evidence, we don't want to store that data for too long, but evidence we need to store for a longer period of time. So those are things that needed to be implemented as well. As far as evolving policy, as I explained, we changed calls for service. We added responsibilities or certain calls for service that they had to respond to. And then there's costs associated with that, which not only include the camera, but the docking stations, batteries, any kind of fasteners that attach to the officer's uniform. So these equipment costs were also a challenge.
All right, so now we'd like to open it up to you. Thanks for listening to our presentation. Do you have any ideas that would help us do better on compliance or questions for us?
Before we get to the questions, let me just say, I don't know if you all feel the same way, but how proud this process makes me of our organization. To imagine a bunch of employees volunteering to come up here and tell the public and the workforce over and over again on Channel 11, repeating that this is what we intend to accomplish, this is how we intend to get there, and then measure it and tell you whether or not they're getting there. And then more specifically, how many communities out there would love to have their police force get up there and talk about them candidly, about what they do with body-worn camera data and what their goals are for achieving that. We should be really proud of this, and our community should be really proud of this. So this is your opportunity to ask them really hard questions and give them ideas about how to improve that and improve our pride level here.
First, thank you for your presentation. When you find gaps in activation, is this part of the performance coaching that your supervisors conduct with the officers when they have a lower compliance rate or activation rate?
Yes, so this is actually something that we're just starting to do, because really it's only been very recently that we've had any insight into this data. So like I said, we tend to look at it at a higher level and identify appropriate targets, and then yes, their supervisors will coach them on how to improve this.
Could you tell us more of the selection of the camera? Like obviously there must have been hundreds of cameras that you could have selected from. What were some of the criteria that you decided on this? And are you still continuing to look for new camera technology that might address your shortcomings and or your challenges?
Sure.
So as part, when the team was put together to implement body-worn cameras, that was part of the discussion. So there were specifics that we wanted, right? We did have multiple agencies come in and provide us with presentations on what they had, but then we also did a request for quotes on that, so then we knew what we were looking at. And so that's that's how we identified which organization, which company we went with, and it's Axon.
And of course, we're always looking at improvements, and our current vendor is making continuous improvements. So we look at things like, is it realistic or feasible to have automatic activation, for instance? Oh, is that something you're interested in? Automatic activation is actually more complicated than I originally thought when I got into this. There are some concerns about, for example, officer privacy. So one of the reasons that we have selected the 30-second loop instead of, say, a 20-minute loop ahead of time is because of you might be in the bathroom. You might be having a conversation that has nothing to do with your call, and how much of that is it important to capture and how much of that is important to store. Additionally, our officers are instructed as much as possible to make separate videos for each call that they go on so that things don't overlap for evidentiary purposes. So we do, of course, keep an eye out for new innovations and new technology as it comes around. At the moment, this vendor's meeting our needs.
Any other questions? I just had one last question then. You talked about the enormous amount of data, and we know that we're now creating public records and maintaining public records and dispersing public records and responding to public records requests. Just give us an idea of the administration. Are we talking about one full-time person to handle those records that we had to add? How much did we have to add to our administrative staff in order to accommodate this?
So one of the most important additions to our administrative staff on this is a redactionist. So that blurring of the video doesn't happen automatically, but we have to do it to meet public records requests. So over time, the duties and hours, I believe, of that individual have increased. So it's something that we definitely have been looking at. Broadly, this is incorporated into our technical services unit, and so it's part of their responsibilities.
Any last questions before we move on to the next subject? Well, thank you for that presentation. That was wonderful. And we're moving on to the next performance measure, which is police encounter satisfaction. Take it away.
We'll just give it 1 second to load, and then we'll be ready to go. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Carlina Orozco. I'm an analyst in the Strategic Planning Analysis and Research Center with Tempe Police.
My name is Kim Hale. I'm a commander in our Metro Bureau.
And today we're going to be discussing police encounter satisfaction. So this falls under our Strong Community Connections Council priority, which is really centered on developing and maintaining strong community connection by really emphasizing the importance of open government, customer service, transparency, communication with community members. And with this measure, we strive to achieve ratings of strongly agree or agree with perceptions of officers treating you fairly, listening carefully, caring about one's well-being, being honest, and being satisfied with how encounters are resolved greater than or equal to the 2017 benchmark as measured in the ASU Citizen Survey. So next we'll talk a little bit more about this survey that I've just mentioned. So this was conducted in conjunction with an ASU Tempe Police Department study on citizen perceptions of body-worn camera in the community. It was conducted in 2016, and the data that we use come from a report that was published in 2017. Interestingly, this is not just limited to residents of Tempe, but any individuals who were in Tempe and had an encounter with one of our officers, so it could be non-residents as well. We were already doing a citizen survey that had numerous questions about body-worn cameras, so we thought this is a great opportunity for us to ask some questions about citizen perceptions and satisfaction with interactions with our officers. So with that, we conducted, or actually ASU, the research team, conducted phone surveys with a sample of these individuals. Before the surveys were conducted, we were mindful of any sensitive cases, so those were removed before the sampling occurred. Once they arrived at that full sample, they then conducted phone surveys and produced these findings, which we'll talk about in just a few moments.
A lot of the things that the survey focused on was, are we treating people fairly? Are we being impartial in our connections with the community? Procedural justice is a term that has been around for a while, and it basically embodies everything that Carlina just spoke about. You know, are we giving folks a voice in the contact that we have with them? Are we impartial in the way that we are conducting ourselves? Are we treating them with dignity and respect? Those are all the things that we try to embody as a police department and try to make sure our officers are conveying out on the street. This is nothing really, I'll be honest, nothing new to policing. Sir Robert Peel, he's the father of modern policing. In the 1800s, he came up with 9 principles of policing. And one of those was maintaining that historic understanding that police are part of the community and that the community is part of the police. We don't function effectively without that community connection. That is the most important part that we have. I've had the opportunity over the last 30 years to work for 6 different police chiefs, and every single one of them, I'm proud to say, in this police department, has always emphasized a lot of those connections with the police department. Our current Chief Moyer is no exception to that. She has come in and very strategically tried to implement ways in which our officers can connect with the community and be very strategic in how we get our information out so that our training is on point and that we continue to reinforce how important the community is to the police department.
So although it can be challenging to measure these dynamic interactions that we have between our officers and the community, it's really critical that we do so. It's critical to police legitimacy as well as police community relations. And so that's why it's so important for us to examine these sentiments of encounter satisfaction. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the baseline data. This was one report. It was one study that was conducted, and we'll go into that a little bit later. But based on that study, we're going to use this as kind of a jumping off point for future efforts. So as you can see, across all categories, our survey respondents were very satisfied with the encounters that they had with our officers. They also felt that these encounters were procedurally just. And we'll start from the top. 90% of those survey respondents felt that they were treated fairly. 88% felt that the officer listened carefully. 82% felt that the officer showed concern for their well-being. 87% felt that the officer acted honestly. And 73% felt that they were satisfied with the resolution. Now, I do want to say that resolutions and outcomes can vary. Some may not be ideal for a community member, specifically if there's something that just occurred and needs more investigation or a little more follow-up and it's kind of left open. That may not be ideal. But considering, the range of outcomes that can occur, 73% is still very positive in terms of being satisfied with the resolution. I will say that this may be a little bit different than what you have on your sheet, but these are the actual numbers from the report. So this is what we're using as our baseline targets. So we have implemented a number of strategies in the department to ensure that these interactions are positive. The first being community-centered efforts. So the department really emphasizes community involvement, community engagement, specifically neighborhood association meetings, participation in community events or community organizations, and also being responsive to any community concerns that may arise.
So we talked a little bit about strategic partnerships and how we need to get out in the community, and we encourage our officers to do that. But we also look at, who in the community is it that we can kind of leverage our resources with so that we can get the most bang for our buck, so to speak, because we have limited resources, we have limited time. So reaching out to the community and neighborhood associations, where the neighborhood associations can continue to share the information that we have with other members in the community. There was a opportunity that we had to sit down with a particular group of leaders that wanted more information about a particular criminal case. We were able to bring out the evidence to them, let them see it, let them ask us questions, so they have a much better understanding of what happened in this particular case. They were able to then to go back to their community and share with them how transparent we were. It's those kind of opportunities and partnerships that we're constantly looking for so that we can, again, connect with the community, because without the community, and I'll emphasize this again, without the community, we cannot be an effective police department. So that partnership is critical to us. The visibility, we look hard as far as analyzing what kind of cars do we drive? How do we mark up those cars? How do we spend our time in that we're not obligated to calls for service to patrol, and how are we patrolling? What do our uniforms look like? Are they professional? What is our grooming standards? Once we're seen, are we proud of what people see as far as our grooming standards, the professional look of our uniforms? So the visibility is very important to us in getting out into the community, letting the community see who we are, and having opportunities to interact and ask us questions. Proactivity, there's obligated time. That's the time that officers spend responding to calls for service that are driven by the community. And there's times when they're not being called, and so we're looking at what do they do in those off times, and how are they spending that off time? Are they going out and introducing themselves to different community members? Are they going out and patrolling in areas that we think that there might be high crime rates, that we can try to bring those down, and strategically using that unobligated time? We design our patrol schedules around trying to make sure that our officers have unobligated time so they can get out into the community and form and make those relationships that are so critical to us.
Also, another item to note is our crime suppression efforts, specifically our complex and compound response strategy hierarchy meetings, otherwise known as our CRUSH meetings. And during these monthly meetings, we address and discuss community concerns, any cases of interest, any crime patterns that we see, as well as repeat incidents, repeat locations, and any long-term issues that we're continuing to address. Although we do have this monthly meeting, it's important to note that this really falls under a larger stratified model for reducing crime. We are an evidence-based organization, and so we use data-driven strategies to address community issues and address crime and disorder on a daily basis. But this monthly meeting really allows us to kind of dive in and see where everyone is, and it holds all of us accountable for addressing these issues in the community.
So another important strategy for us is training. What are we training our officers in? De-escalation is one of the hot topics right now that's going across the nation, and that is much more than just, when people think of de-escalation, they think, how are they talking to people, and can they verbally, take somebody that's in a state of crisis and bring them down and better communicate with them? That's definitely part of de-escalation, but there's also other parts of de-escalation that are equally as important. So to try to get a better handle for that, we've actually able to obtain a grant, and it's a fairly large grant, and partnered with ASU, where we are sending our officers out to look at best practices throughout the U.S. and probably throughout the world to try to figure out what are other departments doing, what is it that we can bring back and implement here within Tempe to try to make sure that we have a good understanding and are implementing de-escalation tactics so that our citizens can, receive the benefits of that. Interview and communication. We have another detective that he's worked for the last 4 years with forensic psychologists in trying to use science-based practices to say, how do you better interview somebody to make sure that you're getting the best information? Well, a lot of that has to do with building rapport from the very beginning of that conversation. And so we're implementing this new outline that's been developed with the FBI and these forensic psychologists to make sure that our officers are starting that rapport building. So we're really trying to innovate in the police department. Human performance team is another team that's out there that's using and focusing on how do we get the best performance from our officers, focusing a lot on their wellness, focusing on are they healthy, are they in a good place, so when they go out on the street, they're not focused on some health issues or some other things that are going on in their life, and so that they can then focus on the right things with a positive attitude and reaching out to the community. This includes even breathing techniques, might include some kind of building resiliency through yoga. We've got therapy dogs that are coming online. A lot of things that are focused on this resiliency of the mental health to help to bring the officers back, which dovetails right into employee wellness. So we're teaching about the health of the officers to make sure that those are the kind of things that really can impact the squad. If you can imagine, a six-person squad that goes out there, and then all of a sudden one officer twists an ankle, and the next one goes down for some other type of injury. You went from 6 to 4, and somebody had a vacation planned, a year in advance, so they paid for a cruise. Pretty soon, that squad gets cut down. And so we really need to make sure that our officers and their wellness is looked after. So if our officers are healthy, they're in a good spot mentally, it reflects in how they conduct business in the community.
So in terms of future directions, we're actually in the final stages of selecting a vendor for an app-based community survey. This will allow us to have real-time, consistent data. We can measure these sentiments frequently. That'll allow us to look at measures of trust, measures of satisfaction with police encounters, and have that micro-level data that we can then use to inform policy and practice. Also, continued community efforts. We have a very strong presence on Nextdoor. We use that for community safety bulletins, for safety polls, or any type of engagement is another outlet that we use in the department to engage with community members.
Monitoring our performance through those different measures. There's a lot of different things that we can measure as a police department, and oftentimes what we measure is kind of shows what our priorities might be. So it's important that we're picking the right measures so our officers understand what we're trying to accomplish through those measurements, and we understand what we're trying to accomplish through those measurements. We talked about body-worn camera activation. That's a measurement. We talk about crime rates. Crime rates of all sorts and variety. Those are measurements that we look at. That shows, are we being effective sometimes as a police department? We're looking at, community satisfaction. Are people satisfied with the way after we finish an engagement? I'm proud just the other day I received an email commendation from a citizen who just received a citation from one of our officers. And that's those contacts we talked about as far as the resolution. It's hard, if you can imagine, to say that, well, I was very satisfied with that citation I received, right? But this citizen was so impressed with the officer's professionalism, the way that they conducted themselves, and when they got home, they wrote us an email and commended the officer about that contact. Those are the kind of outcomes that we like to see from our officers, obviously, and it's also very nice to see our community recognize our officers when they have those opportunities.
So some of the challenges that we faced with this specific performance measure, data collection. This study was a large-scale, multifaceted effort. It was expensive as well, and so that's why it has not been replicated in its entirety. However, we've identified these ways to collect the same data, given its importance and how much of a priority it is to our department, to make sure that we can collect that data in a sustainable fashion, and so we're excited to propel that forward.
So increased demands on our officers. These are not only challenges, but I call them opportunities as well, because these are opportunities for us to grow, but at the same time, we have to look at the different commitments and as they take away from other parts of our mission, right? And so we were just talking the other day about all the different things that our officers do. We have peer support committees, de-escalation committees, use of force committees, SWAT team and all the training that goes with those, the hostage negotiations, the canine training, the technology committees, all these different things that really there's an expectation in the community to say, we believe these resources are important, we need them, but at the same time, each one of those resources takes a commitment to get to a certain standard and level of professionalism that might take the officer off the street for a period of time. There's other things that come across that are unfunded mandates where the county attorney might change a procedure that says, okay, we want you now to all start serving these domestic violent order protections. Those take time to serve and to try to track the person down. It takes more than one officer. We get mental health petitions from the different organizations out there that say this person missed their appointment, they're no longer taking their medication, we want you to go pick them up. Those all go to our officers, and it takes 2 officers to go out. Another unfunded mandate that we have to send our officers to. Those all take time. So those are things that are challenges as they continue to commit our officers to things that we weren't prepared for sometimes when they come around the corner. Sentiments towards law enforcement. So I think that we've all been around enough to see the pendulum kind of swing back and forth. And one of the things that we'll see is sometimes we'll see a national narrative that starts to kick up. A lot of people turn to Ferguson because it was such a large event in the nation. And one of the things that is very apparent is the issues sometimes that take place nationally aren't the issues that are occurring here in Tempe. And I'm proud to say that we have been insulated a lot from some of the negative sentiments that you might see going on nationally. And that's because of the ongoing and continued efforts that we take place here. The problem that we have is that through social media and through mainstream media and all the things that people digest, it's those national news stories and the negative, that continues to reinforce maybe some of those negative sentiments that are going on, maybe on a national level, but when you look locally, it's not happening. And so we have to continually try to ensure our citizens that does not reflect us, You know, it's an officer wearing a blue uniform in whatever state. That's not happening here in Tempe. And so those are narratives sometimes that are important for us to address. We address them in community meetings, we address them, you know, one-on-one, but it's a reality that we have to deal with, and it can become a challenge.
So with that, we thank you for your time, and we're open to any ideas or questions that you may have for us.
Questions? I'm going to repeat what I said before about how proud this makes me of the city, just because, Commander Hale, I agree, and I believe you when you tell me that some of these principles have been in place in policing for over 100 years, but I would say there are probably a lot of communities out there who would like to see their police force actively try to improve the ways in which they're collecting feedback from the community, put it out there in public, and then talk about how to improve it. I don't think that's happening everywhere, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
The survey, oh, there's a microphone. The survey-based app, is that going to be an app that you need to download by itself? And it's just going to be if you have an interaction with an officer or a call for service, you guys are going to let them know to download this app and provide feedback? Or is it going to be like a once a year push or twice a year push? Do we have more details about that?
Sure. We're still in the RFP process right now for this. However, we're looking at collecting data monthly is the goal, so that we would have much more frequent feedback.
Don't make me call you. Alex. No? Well, it was very thoroughly explained. I'm sure there are some questions out there. No? Okay. Well, let's congratulate this team on this great presentation.
Send us your ideas and suggestions to tempeaccelerates@tempe.gov and visit us at tempe.gov/tempeaccelerates.